Thank you. So my name is Aurelien Keller, and I'll be presenting my thesis, monitoring capture stressors and behavioral responses in herring and mackerel during the capture and release from purse seines to INFER welfare status. My promoter was Jeppe Kolding, and my supervisors were Mike Breen and Neil Anders from the Institute of Marine Research in Norway. So first, a little bit of background about purse seining and slipping. So purse seining is a method of fishing where a net is laid in the water to surround a school of fish. The bottom of this net is then pulled close using a purse wire, and then the net is hauled in to capture the whole school of fish. Worldwide, it accounts for 28% of wild catches, and this is due to it being highly efficient and yielding high-quality fish. Slipping is an essential part of the process due to once the school is captured, slipping is the only way to release the fish if they are the wrong species, if they are the wrong size, or if the school is simply too large for the ship to bring it all on board. This is done through introducing slack into a control line, and this leads to a Yail opening forming, and this lets the fish escape without exiting the water. It was long thought to be harmless because the fish are never leaving the water, but there's been mounting evidence that it can have negative impacts, and so Europe, the European Union, anti slipping by instituting a limit on how much of the net can be pulled in before slipping has to begin. And so the other aspect here is welfare. In my thesis, I used a functional definition of fish welfare, and this means that good welfare is contingent on biological systems being in normal range, so ensuring that the fish do not encounter any situations that they could not encounter in the wild, or something that is close enough that it would not impact them negatively. And we used behavior as a proxy for welfare status. And we can see here on the left an example of good welfare, where the fish are escaping in an ordered manner with some level of crowding, but they still have some distance from each other so they don't bump into each other to injure each other. And then on the right here, we have an example of poor welfare, where the fish are spilling out. They're relatively disordered, and there's a lot of contact occurring between the fish. So the aims of the study were to describe behavior during the purse seine capture. This was to be done in the catch, as they were escaping at the Yail opening, and post-slipping, once they had all the space they wanted. And then this was done through behavioral metrics, and so these metrics were critically examined for reliability, and then they were analyzed to find relationships between the different metrics, and all this to be able to use the newfound understanding to infer impact on welfare, on fish welfare, and offer recommendations moving forward. So the sampling occurred during 11 casts over 5 research cruises between 2016 and 2019. These were done in the Norwegian Sea or the Norwegian fjords. There were 6 casts for mackerel and 5 casts for herring. So for each cast, there were video that was captured, and this was done through shooting a catch monitoring probe into the catch using an air cannon. This probe contained a video camera and an oxygen probe. There were 2 cameras positioned on the Yail opening that recorded behavior as the fish escaped, and then there was a drop camera that was lowered right at the level of the Yail opening, about 10 meters in front of the net, that once again had a horizontal and a vertical camera. And then for all the video footage, it was scored for 6 different metrics. There was a crowding score as a way to approximate the density of the fish. Schooling order, how ordered the fish were. This is important because both herring and mackerel are obligatory schoolers, so school order can be indicative of stress and welfare status. Turning score, how frequent rapid changes in direction were occurring. Escape behavior, were the fish escaping all as one big group? Were they escaping in little groups? Were they leaving the net and then returning to the net? Net contact, were the fish coming in contact with the net, which is known to cause injuries. And finally, presence, absence of dead fish, which is a really good indicator of bad welfare. And then this was followed by quality control and establishing correlations. So the quality control was done using other observers who viewed the same footage, and this was checked for reliability and repeatability using Krippendorff's alpha coefficient, which is a measure of inter-observer reliability that gives us a score which we can use to gauge the agreement between observers. And then data exploration was done by graphing each metric by cast and by camera angle with time. And then I went through all those graphs to try and find any patterns, and these patterns were then confirmed using correlations. We used two types of correlations, Kendall's tau and a Goodman-Kruskal's tau, and using these together was to make sure it was robust and we were sure of the correlations. And then we selected metrics to try and model. So there were many interesting correlations that we wanted to look into, but unfortunately the only reliable metric was crowding score. So we decided to try and model that one. And to do so, we had to use a ordered logit model due to it being a categorical response variable. And when checking the model assumptions, collinearity was detected between cast and species, as well as between time and camera angle. So this meant we had to split up this model into four separate models, with the species being separated and the time and the camera angle being separated. So here's the output for the mackerel and time model. What we have on the y-axis, we have probability of observing a given crowding score. On the x-axis, we have proportional time, and each of the little graphs corresponds to one cast, with the cast identifier being at the top here. And if we take cast BO2 as an example, we can see that crowding starts relatively low, or the probability of observing low crowding is quite high, and then as that decreases, the probability of observing higher crowding increases. And this is the story that's repeated in all of the graphs and tells us that in general, crowding increases as the cast progresses. Here we have the same graph, except it's herring in time. And we see a similar story with crowding increasing over time, but with herring, we start at a lower crowding level, and it seems to take longer for the crowding to increase, and the higher crowding levels are still less probable than with mackerel. And here we have the output from the mackerel and camera angle model, where once again on the y-axis we have the probability of observing a given crowding score, and on the x-axis we have the different camera angles, and each cast getting its own little graph. If we go to BO2 again as the example, we see that the crowding in the the order of the cameras relates to the order at which the fish appear in. So first they are in the catch, and then they are at the Yail opening, and then they're in the drop camera. So we see that in the catch, the density is not very high, but it's not particularly low either. At the Yail opening, we see higher crowding being observed, and then after the escape, we see very low crowding. And this is something that's repeated across the casts. And so for the herring model with camera angle, we have the similar thing occurring. If we take cast CO2 with some crowding occurring in the catch, and then higher crowding occurring at the Yail, and lower crowding occurring once the fish have escaped. And we see once again that it seems that the probabilities and the spikes in crowding that occur at the Yail are lower with the herring. Once we finished modeling crowding score, we decided to use the dissolved oxygen data that we had recorded from the catch monitoring probe to model dissolved oxygen in relation to crowding score. So we used a linear mixed model with a crowding score as an explanatory variable and cast as a random variable. The model gave us a conditional pseudo R-squared of 0.57, meaning that 57% of the variability was explained by this simple model. Unfortunately, the normality assumption could not be met even after transforming the data. But with the type of data we had and the large amount of data points, it's mostly okay to overlook this assumption in this case. And here on the right, we have a graph showing the model output with dissolved oxygen decreasing as crowding score increases. So the key results from all this was that crowding increases over time, and that peak crowding occurs as the fish are escaping through the Yail opening, and that there are differences between the species, with mackerel seeming more susceptible to higher crowding than herring. We found that dissolved oxygen decreases as crowding increases, but it's important to note that with the data that we managed to collect, there was no point at which dissolved oxygen levels reached a low enough level to cause poor welfare. And finally, it's the first description of the whole capture and slipping process in Norwegian commercial purse seine fisheries, and the first time dead fish were observed post-slipping, or immediately post-slipping. So some limitations of the study were the time-consuming aspect of video analysis. It took 2.5–3 months of video analysis to get through all the footage and have data that I could work with. So automating it in the future using machine learning with reference footage would be an interesting thing to look into. Another one was the large quantity and the nested nature of the data. Here, the diagram on the right indicates the structure of the data, with it being split into species and then being split into each cast and then split by camera. And while we were only able to use crowding score, it's important to remember that within each of these cameras, there is 6 different metrics that could have been used. And finally, the biggest limitation was the reliability of the metrics. Unfortunately, only crowding score was usable, and this is probably due to 3 different points. One is the definitions may not have been exact enough for the different observers to record the same scores. The video analysis method used by the different observers may have led to some differences. And finally, the statistical method used to establish reliability may have some issues in the application that we used. So the conclusions are, so high crowding can lead to poor welfare. This is quite well established. This is due to contact between fish and the net and fish with each other, causing injuries. And mackerel and herring, especially mackerel, are known to be quite sensitive to injuries. The Yail opening creating a bottleneck effect, causing a spike in the crowding of the fish. And so this thesis brings strong evidence to support the negative welfare impacts of slipping. It also helped to establish metrics that can be used in future studies. And a couple of recommendations for to help reduce these negative welfare impacts. Clarifying the slipping regulation. Currently, for example, in Norway, the regulation for the slipping of mackerel is that the Yail opening needs to allow the fish to swim freely to escape, which is very broad and vague. So making it more exact and possibly setting a minimum size for the Yail opening could help at least reduce the bottleneck effect. And instituting good slipping practices, because depending on, according to some conversations I had, different ships and different crews will be more or less adept at proper slipping practices. Thank you for your attention.